Right, my father was Sean Keenan. He was born in St Columb Street, just round the corner from St Column's, Wales. He was born into a family of five, four boys and one girl. His family were a Republican family. His father had spent time in prison, interned. In fact, he had been tried three times on the one charge, and eventually the jury had disagreed at each time, so he was released. He was allowed out of prison literally to die. He was very ill in prison and he was allowed out. And his three sons were in prison at that time. So he married my mother, who was Nancy Ward, who had also been interned in the 40s. They married after both of them had been released around the mid 40s, and married and set up home in St Column Street. And once again, there was a family of five, three boys and two girls. He was a man who, well, my recollection is he was very principled. He hated injustice and, in fact, fought against it most of his life. He had spent quite a few years, 13, 14 years in prison without trial. I know he went to prison when I was about 7 and wasn't released until I was about 12. And in those days, that wasn't a common occurrence. There was only a handful of people in Derry who had been interned. He was articulate. He was very gentle and kind. And one of the stories I always remember hearing about him was that he had stopped an eviction in the Lecky Road. It would probably have been about the early 50s. He watched the bailiffs carrying furniture out of a house, and he asked people who were standing by watching, would any of them help him? And one man stepped forward. I think he was a man called Haggerty. And at one stage, the bailiffs were outside and they got inside and closed the door, and there was a standoff, and eventually the bailiffs went away. Turned out later that the woman had been married to a British soldier, but that didn't come into the equation at all. She was being evicted, and we all know what eviction means in Ireland.
So he had a very strong sense of justice and injustice.
He had a strong sense of, what I like to call, what was right and what was wrong. And my mother was exactly the same, very strong woman. Her and two of her sisters had been interned in Armagh prison. And at any time, internees then, in that time, could have signed a paper saying they would not continue with their beliefs or in doing anything that was contrary to the state. And they could have been released from prison, but none of them would do it.
So that period between 1968 and 72, what's your memories of your father and mother at that stage and the roles they played?
By that stage, my mother wasn't too well. Her health wasn't good, but my father was. He was very active. He was active in the civil rights movement and the Derry Action Committee, Derry Citizens Action Committee, although he did not play a major or a big role in either of those organisations. It was in 1960, was late 68, early 69, that there was a meeting called of concerned residents. I mean, there had been a lot of rioting up to then. There had been, you'd had Burntallet, you'd had the death of Sammy Devaney, where the RUC were just marauding through the the streets. I mean, they came down Fawn Street, I think it was in January. It was around the time of Burntallet. It was January 69, and attacked the homes in St. Colum's, Wales. I mean, they were the homes of poor people, people who didn't have anything at all. Uh, and the police and the B specials attacked their homes, and all of this was because people were actually getting off their knees and standing up for what they believed to be right.
So there was a meeting of like.
There was a meeting. Called in, I think it was the Harps Hall in the Brandywell, by concerned residents, and the Derry Citizens Defence Committee was set up at that time. My father was elected by the people who were there as chairperson, and a man called Johnny White was the secretary. All organisations at the time, including the Derry Action Committee, were invited to send along representatives, and they did, and some of those representatives were also on the committee. The Derry Citizens Action Committee had sort of come to an end at that time, and everything was changing. So at that meeting, it was decided that the two priorities would be to keep the peace and the defence of the area. And that's more or less probably what the meeting was called for. I mean, not everybody liked the thought of my father being the chairperson, him being a Republican, but he never made any secret of the fact that he was a Republican. In fact, there was a big input from the Republican movement at that time, although nothing was really organised. People would have been there, you know, in an individual capacity rather than as an organisation. And I mean, the Derry City Defence Committee, once the Battle of the Bogside, I mean, just before the Battle of the Bogside, my father, and it may have been Paddy Doherty, or as they call him, Paddy Bogside, had went to meet the apprentice boys to ask them not to march, or at the very least to reroute, and not to march past the flashpoints would have been the Waterloo Place and Little James's Street, but they refused and held their march. And, you know, the rest is history. Everybody knows what happened that day and that night. I mean, at the time, the Battle of the Bogside, there was over 1,000, over that couple of days, there was over 1,000 canisters of gas fired at the people from the Bogside. Nobody knows exactly how many petrol bombs were thrown, but I know the old City Dairy lost around 20,000 bottles at the time, so you can sort of do your sums.
So do you believe that period was a big turning point in the city?
I think it was a turning point. I think it was a turning point because for so long, you know, people talk about civil rights, and civil rights was definitely the right way to go. But for years there had been gerrymandering, you know, I mean, a nationalist town with a unionist heavy council, and that was just because of the electoral wards and the way that there was housing. In fact, it was one of the reasons why the council would not build houses, because they did not want nationalists moving out of their ghettos. In fact, when they did decide on housing, they built the Rosville Flats, which kept everybody in the ghetto, and didn't change the electoral boundaries at all.
So
and you had the university, the situation of the university. When everybody thought that the university was coming to Derry, which was the second city, we were told then that Craigavon the new town would be the second city, and the university went to Coleraine. So you had all of that. I mean, the housing was absolutely scandalous. Uh, I don't like using Protestants and Catholics, but you have to in this instance, and Catholics could not get houses. You know, there was Catholic families, maybe 3 and 4 Catholic families living in a small house that was really meant for one family. And because of that, there was the emergence of the Housing Action Committee, and that was a group. I think it was Eamon McCann, Eamon Malach, Bridget Bond, people like that, who sort of put a focus on the bad housing, and not just the state of housing, the lack of housing, and they protested, and they pulled a caravan across the Lecky Road, and they sat in the Guildhall and refused to move. They had numerous protests at the time, and with all of that, and then all of the unrest of the Battle of the Bogside, and people were then saying, we want more than British civil rights. We want, unity, not in just that sort of harsh way, but people were, you had the deaths of Cusick and Beatty around that time. There was just so much going on, and it was the RUC, the Stormont government at the time, just putting their boot on the nationalists. I mean, when the Battle of the Bogside was taking place, there was calls went out to Belfast, Newry, Armagh, places like that, for protests, so as to sort of stretch the RUC so as they couldn't concentrate on the Bogside. And I mean, in Belfast, I think it was about 9 people ended up dead. At least over the period of the Battle of the Bogside, we had no deaths. Prior to it, we had the death of Sammy Devaney, and we had the death of a man called McCluskey in Dungiven. But I mean, Belfast got it much, much harder, and I suppose one thing that maybe worked in our favour was the fact that we were a nationalist city.
Okay. So finally, why do you think it's important to remember these stories?
To remember
these stories? The stories?
Well, I mean, I think for one thing, because he was there. Another thing, because of the role he played. It wasn't just an office role sitting, being chairperson of an organisation. I mean, there was a lot of organisation to be done. I mean, the barricades were up, so there was a whole of that area to run. You had to make sure that essential services were getting in. You had to make sure that there was a certain amount of policing, and that did not include the RUC. You had all of the sort of everyday things. You had money to raise, and I think he played a pivotal role at that time. He also went to Dublin to talk to the government at the time, Jack Lynch and some of the rest of them, Charlie Haughey, Neil Blaney, about if things got worse, about them supplying arms or sending troops to the border, because Jack Lynch had made the statement, "We'll not stand idly by." So he and some of the other people on the Defence Association went and asked exactly what he meant by that, and would they help. So for all of that, I mean, that was all happening in 1969. By 1971, he was interned. And then his son, Colin, my brother, was shot dead in March while my father was interned, and he was released for 4 or 5 days at the time. So I think his life, he never looked for anything for himself. His life was about doing right for his community. Because if you're a Republican, you're also a community activist. I think the two actually go hand in hand. I think they work together.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sweet Jesus Christ, my
Can we
nerves.
just get one more sentence? Just whenever you're asked why you think it's important to remember these stories, if you could reply back with, I think it's important to remember these stories because, and just a single sentence, it was just because in your original reply you just said because, and we're cutting out the...
Because of the role he played.
Yeah, so
But
just
it's
say,
just
I think
different.
it's important to
And
remember
his
because
life.
of the role he played, and that'd
Right,
be grand,
okay.
we still have the rest of
Right.
it, so yeah, just whenever you're ready, address.
So why is it important to remember these stories?
I think it's important to remember these stories because of the work he'd done around that time, because of the life he led, and because if we don't remember these stories ourselves, other people will tell them and will not always be accurate. You cannot always leave the telling of history to the last man standing.